I'm Erin Joe. I am in the office of the CISO for Google Cloud. I help customers with security modernization and cloud adoption. And I'm going to have my panelists go ahead and introduce themselves.
Great. Hi, my name is Michael Leland. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist at Sentinel One. Sentinel One has been, for about 10 years now, building and deploying AI-driven detection technologies for endpoint, cloud, and recently identity. We tried our best to build a TI inside our organization for many, many years, realized others are doing it much better. I came to SecOps, though, about 25 years ago. I was the co-founder and CTO of a company called Nitro Security before we sold our company to McAfee in 2011, before they destroyed my product in 2019. But so security operations and the use of threat intelligence has been kind of part and parcel of everything I've done for years. And now I do thought leadership, content creation, and delivery, most recently on things like AI and the use of it in security operations and the cyber practice. And just happy to be here to talk about kind of how we're using it, and more importantly, how much we appreciate the relationship and the integration with Mandiant and what it affords our customers as business outcomes.
Great. And my name is Ryan Whalen, so I run Accenture Cyber Intelligence. I started there about 2 months ago. Before that, I was the CISO and EVP of Enterprise Tech at a startup battery manufacturer out of Michigan. And prior to that, I ran all Intel services at Mandiant and Google. And then, I've been in the industry for about 15 years, started in government, came from like a military background, right? Moved into consulting, went to places like PwC, did a lot of strategy consulting, a lot of like, how are we doing technology transformations? How are we doing data-driven transformations? Probably some of the themes we'll talk about, I think, today. But had an Intel background through that whole time, and so weaving in, a lot of my time working with executives was how are we using kind of insights that we're getting out of, right, or even low-level signals that we're getting out of kind of different data sources, and being able to make decisions with those. And so one of the things that we're trying to do on the Accenture side is look at how do we extend the use of threat intelligence, right, beyond traditional security operations, a lot of the traditional security operations use cases, and make it a lot more applicable or helpful, right, in a business sense, right? Hence the competitive, I think, advantage title today. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. I think we've also talked about it for years, but with the advent of some of the technological advances that are really starting to emerge now, we're at a point where we can actually maybe make that happen and do it in a way where we can use technology to augment us in our day jobs, where many of us, I think, are strapped to. We have this vision for what we want to do, but it's hard sometimes to get to that vision because we spend so much time bogged down into some of the kind of traditional security tasks. So really excited about the discussion today, and hopefully it'll be informative.
And I too came into Google Cloud from Mandiant, and I did that after a very long career in the government. And I did a lot of public speaking even back then in the government. And let me just make this my little disclaimer. I'm no longer in the government. I don't speak for the government. Everything's based on my own personal experience. But to that end, I want to share my thoughts about what I have been talking about for many, many, many years related to the competitive advantage side of today's discussion. And the analogy I used was in the auto industry. So there had been a lot of safety concerns, many crashes, people dying in crashes, people getting hurt in crashes. And what ended up happening was a lot of legislation and seatbelt requirements, right? That never used to be a law. It became a law. And people resisted initially. I'm not wearing seatbelts, that's too difficult. That's, there's no way you're gonna get me to use a seatbelt, all of those things early on. But then we adapted. And the seatbelts became not only the norm, but the expected, and they saved lives and made a difference. And then the auto industry started to react to even more of a demand signal from the public, which was, well, we do expect to be safe when we use these vehicles, and we should be safe when driving on the roads. So then what happened? Well, then technology changed, and we started to get sensors and airbags and auto driving to help out to be safe, and all kinds of things that are now called safety features, right? And those features create a competitive advantage in the auto industry because depending on what you're looking for, you have a baseline expectation of safety and security in any vehicle that you buy, And then you do pay more depending on what kinds of additional security items you want added. So that's an industry that said, we need to respond to the demand signal. We have to make changes for safety, just the same way we do in our industry. And I think, like Ryan has alluded to already, there are areas where we can use intelligence for a competitive advantage as well. And I have often talked about for many years that the security world will change. And I think it will change in a way where you will have basic expectations of security in the software and in the environments and all the things you do. And then there are going to be additional things that we'll have to continue to bring into that environment for additional safety and security. And I think those things will give us a competitive advantage as well. So for our audience, we want to help try to focus, because I think we're going to talk about a lot of things today. So to help them focus and listen for key points, what would be your main takeaway that you'd want the audience to walk away with today, Michael? So
I think, you've done some government work, you've had a background in government, and in military, there's a term called situational awareness, right? And it's having the right information at the right time put in front of the right person to make the right decision, right? And those are 4 very unique aspects of information gathering and sharing that help us make informed decisions quickly and effectively by the right talent pool if you can find them, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think when we think about threat intel as it relates to both cyber and even auto industry and all of these things where it really matters, I think it really comes down to there's information that's helpful and there's people that need it. And that pathway between the source of information and the people that can best utilize it, or the tools that need to ingest it and leverage that to make informed decisions, has been the gap. We've been cobbling together things with open source tooling, and standards have evolved, and Styx taxi and now Yara rules, like all of these ways of formulating and communicating and utilizing this technology or telemetry. But I don't think we've yet landed on the right pathway from the source of intel, the curation of that intelligence, the validation and vetting of the information, and then getting it to the right person or technology quickly enough for it to be used intelligently. And so I think what has to happen, much like happened in the auto industry, is we come to expect these things, and vendors are forced to deliver it. Whether it's delivered as a feature or an inherent capability is something that I think each vendor will play differently with in terms of how they offer it. But I think our expectation should be, as Aaron said, we need to deliver safe solutions. We need to deliver business outcomes that are improved at the end of the day. And I think the one takeaway is the intelligence is there, and the products that are looking to leverage it are just waiting for that right stream of information. And we as a community need to find the right pathway to get that information into the products and in front of the right people quicker to make those informed decisions.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about that when we talk about the Better Together story as well, because there have been changes and advancements. Ryan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I like your military analogy, because obviously that's where I came from. I mean, look, the first thing I'll start with is, I think in my definition of intel as a lifelong practitioner in the space, is intel's not intel if it is not driving an action, right? That's why it's time bound, right? It's got to be tied to an action. So whether you're using that to make decisions, whether that you're using that to automate detections, et cetera, you've got to use it. It should be driving a decision. And if it's not doing that, it's not really intel. It's not intel for, writing a long form intel report just because it's interesting on a threat actor, right, is not really intel. It's academic work. And that's fine. That's okay. There's a place for that. But we've really got to drive action. And you guys know this, right? Because intel is one of the first things that'll be looked at in the security budget when it becomes under review. And if decision makers, if the CFO has never seen something out of, right, produced by Intel, or has never seen metrics informed by Intel, doesn't know the use case, right, it gets a lot harder to start defending that budget, right? And so I think making sure that we understand what those use cases are. Every company's different, right? How those decisions, those priorities that matter, it depends on your posture, right? It depends on your industry. It depends on where you're at and your overall kind of business growth journey. But making sure you've got an idea. I think one of the things I'm hoping folks walk away from this with are, I think, like Michael and Aaron both said, we're going to cover a number of themes and a number of topics. I just hope you walk away with a few that matter to you based on where kind of your posture or where your company's postured. But trying to think forward about the industry about, okay, I'll give you an example, right? 2 years ago, we talked often about how we do a better job of informing like mergers and acquisitions, corporate development on risk in target companies, risk in acquisitions, right? Risk in mergers. We talked about it a lot. We didn't see customers coming and buying that a lot, okay? There were some who would think about it, but it wasn't active. Fast forward 2 years, we've seen pretty sizable breaches that came out of activities like that, right? We've seen headline breaches that came out of not doing enough on the due diligence side to understand and then manage the risk of those acquisitions. And so now we have customers coming to us on a regular basis, and that's a full-on product line that we have seen scale over about the last 18 months. And so just right, but not everybody is a company that thrives on corp dev, right? So it just, again, it depends on your use case. But you've got to know those stakeholders. You've got to know who your partners are, because threat intel should be deeply tied in with whoever's managing your enterprise data ecosystem. Obviously, intel data shouldn't sit in its own, security data shouldn't sit in its own silo. It should be able to be integrated. Those insights should be integrated and combined with other data that drive business decisions, right? And so I think just picking up on some of the themes that we lay down, whether that's data transformation, whether that's how we think about the future of security operations architectures, whether that's how we think about fixing the human factor, right, and how we educate and train the human factor. Hopefully, you guys will just walk away with a few of these themes about, okay, I can use intel to inform, right, this one piece, and that's what I'd do. I'd start with one thing that you can do differently, and then grow from there.
Yeah, and I really want to foot stomp on that. I think we've talked forever about using intel more broadly, getting intel to decision makers. Yet, we don't see all organizations doing it yet. And we certainly don't see them doing it as well as they could or should. So while it might seem like we're talking about some of the same things that we've talked about for quite some time, it's clear there's room for improvement, right? It's very clear that every organization could still be asking themselves, how else can I use this intelligence or information? In what other way can this help us in our business processes? How can this help us build resilience? Who else needs to know? Key question that does not get asked nearly as often as it could or should, because we walk into situations all the time where there's been a compromise or some sort of crisis and somebody didn't know, or the intel didn't get where it needed to get to in a timely fashion, or it wasn't actionable in some way. So we're still not there yet. So asking yourself, who else can use this? Who are the other stakeholders? Thinking far more broadly than just those inside of your organization, because no one organization can get through some of these things alone. We've talked about public and private partnerships for many years already. They have improved. I'm very encouraged by what I've seen over just my career lifetime. But I think that now this is a perfect time for others in the community and for the extended, even the next generation of those coming up in the community who maybe don't remember times when we didn't share as well as we could have, and we've had to learn how to do that, to say, well, who else can I share with? Who else is in my community? Who else needs to know? So that we are all well positioned when we need to be ready for something.
I want to point out too, though, that understand what format your stakeholder needs to consume that intelligence as, right? Telling your COO about the wizard spider TTPs
Right.
is probably not going to be an effective use of either of your times, right? But understand, like, boiling that down to business impact as a result of a breach related to those TTPs, put it in their terms. They need to consume it the way their business process and practice can best understand it, and then action on that information as well. Security operations practitioners, they need the TTPs. They need the understanding of the IOCs and the exact artifacts, the atomic indicators. But at a higher level, understand your audience and how they need to consume that information.
Yeah, and I think Kevin hit on that this morning when he talked about what is the right level of conversation to have with the board and up to the executives, and speaking in terms of business outcome and business impact. So if this were to happen, because you talked this morning about what are some of the worst things that could happen, what are we most concerned about, how are we ready? But speaking in terms of, well, these are the things we're most concerned about, this is how we're postured and we're ready for it. These are the gaps that we still have that we haven't filled. And this would be the downtime. And this would be the downstream impact. And these would be the companies or other things that depend on us that would be impacted. But also if something we're concerned about happened to us, right, we're part of a downstream impact as well, of the things that are in our supply chain.
Yeah.
But I know you were going to say.
No, I was just going to pick up. I mean, it was funny you said that because like my brain went to the exact same place, and I think for me, like, you know, for me it was dashboards, right? That's what worked as a CISO. There was no like very little words. It was all numbers and dashboards, and what that meant in like a manufacturing context was mainly uptime, right? Uptime, you know, production rates and things like that. Those are what mattered there. So when we talked about risk, right, we talked about other incidents within the industry and how those impacted, you know, uptime or downtime. But we also talked about like how that related to the architecture that we had on that factory floor, so that we could do things like, you know, effectively patch and effectively manage vulnerabilities in a production environment, but not impact, right, operational time on that factory floor. So you have this thread of a conversation through now, one, hitting business metrics that matter, right, to the operational leadership, but then also kind of building the case for why do we need a team that can operate and sustain, right, an architecture that's designed the way that it is, and then why do we need a data ecosystem, right, and how do we then invest to maintain that and to build that so that it's effective, so that we can get those data and we can have the right perspective to then think through what matters most, right? And then, you know, with things like, and this is the great advantage of a lot of the technology we have today, but all of that can be dynamic, right? It's not a static report that lives in a PowerPoint somewhere, right? You have a Power BI dashboard, or pick whatever visualization tool you want. I forget the Google visualization tool, right? But you can dynamically update that.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's talk about leveraging Intel, right? So we want to make sure that we're really covering that for this audience and thinking in terms of what types of intelligence are being undervalued, perhaps, right? Maybe not used as robustly as it could be or should be. And what have we learned about leveraging it, and how should the audience think about leveraging it?
So, you want to start with me?
Yeah.
Great.
Please.
If you think about threat intel, and remember the original sources, you know, we once looked at ISACs as the source of truth for information relative to a specific vertical, but they became very muddy, right? And separating the reds from the grays, understanding which ones are actionable versus just informative, it was very difficult to consume that and action on that information. It was the signal to noise ratio was way too high. When you think about the way technology solutions, whether it's endpoint protection solution or an email firewall gateway, like all of these technologies need different pieces of information to provide countermeasure support for that. The important thing is that every technology needs to use it at different stages. So for instance, if you're opening an email on an endpoint, you know, you need to know something about the source, the credibility of the domain that you're opening it from, the prevalence of that file across the rest of the environment, you know, the legitimacy of the source email address. Has it been seen before? Has it been, and as you start ranking, you know, what was the old email metric that you would run it through and you get a certain score, and it was never accurate, right? I still got Viagra ads. But the whole idea was that, you know, if I could analyze the information in real time as it's streaming to me, and then build a risk profile about that specific transaction. The problem is that adversaries are getting a whole lot more evolved, right? And they're leveraging AI to do that as well. I think Microsoft claims that 156,000 business email compromise emails are stopped every day. That doesn't count how many get through. But we've seen a 400% increase in the success rate of phishing attacks because the content is looking so much more legitimate. So we can no longer assume that we can just scan something easily and see what it will do. We have to look at behavioral information as well. What happens when it lands on the endpoint? Does it try to perform reconnaissance? And so it's no longer atomic indicators that we're looking for. It's semantic information about the behavioral analysis of what that little piece of code is doing. And whether it's coming through an email gateway or a firewall or landing on an endpoint protected by an AI-based EDR solution, it's more than just, is this bad now? Does it have the potential to be bad based upon its behavior once it's in action? And we as humans are just not good at piecing that level of information together. So I think the technology that's utilizing it needs to leverage it at very different stages. One is at time of access. The other is kind of a staged approach to look for things that might be low and slow. Is it still maintaining persistence and then moving on? Threat intel can afford us the advantage of understanding not just at a specific point in time, but throughout the entire life cycle of that executable or application or email, whether or not it's potentially acting malicious. We leverage it as well from a Sentinel One perspective, and we'll get more about this later about how it's improving things in our MDR practice, right? Most organizations are not in the business of performing cybersecurity. They're in the business of building cars or manufacturing food products. And so their opportunity to outsource that to seasoned professionals, and we're the ones that are utilizing this technology more than anybody else. Because we're using it on a bench of technology professionals that know how to leverage threat intel best, and we're leveraging it inside of our product to do most of the heavy lifting for us. Cybersecurity is a data problem.
Yeah.
And there's just too much of that information, both the presumably benign information and the massive amount of threat intel you've got to compare it against, try to figure out if that benign should be elevated to malicious, and you have to rank and score it each time. So 2 pieces of benign information, when added with threat intel at the top, could actually convict that entire scenario, but by themselves, they will pass right through any filter. And that's the problem, is implying that threat intel by itself is good enough, or that correlation of 2 different static telemetry pieces is enough. It doesn't get you the business outcome you're looking for. It's never going to be an actionable outcome. So I think it's important to understand where and how the technology is leveraging it for the best business.
Yeah, I think that totally resonates. I think you need that end-to-end story,
right?
But I totally agree with you on the need for different technologies, but also kind of different decision makers, different stakeholders across the organization need to access the intel, or maybe the context that the intel provides, right, at different points in time. I think a couple of things. I think a lot of our conversation will focus on security operations, because you need the fundamentals in place first, right? Before we can think about all these other good kind of decisions and decision areas that Intel could potentially integrate with and help, you've got to have the fundamentals down. You've got to know that you've bought down risk for the organization. You've got to have some really, some really clear metrics around what that looks like that should align to business metrics. So making sure you can tell that story, but then that story, that end-to-end, right, that end-to-end story should do a few other things for you as well, right? One, we tend to collect a lot of data that just sits in a SIM, and we don't mobilize it very well, right? We all want to, right? It's for a large variety of good reasons, it's difficult to do, right? But how do we think more, and there's more and more capability on the technology side coming out about how do we do, we've got like our continuous exposure management solutions now on the market, right? It's been big over the last few years. How are we looking at and interrogating that log data on a regular basis, right? And how are we interrogating bidirectional log data, right? Or how are we interrogating dropped data, right? There's all these data that we kind of leave on the cutting room floor just because it's, frankly, from a human perspective, you're never going to get there if you try and put SOC analysts on reviewing that, right? It has to be machined. But if we have tooling that can do that right, we can correlate that data with, right, known indicators of malicious behavior, to your point, right? Some of that will be atomic indicators, but a lot of that's really, how do I look at that full kind of attack life cycle, across the SIM? I think that's really important. I talked a little bit about the metrics piece. I think thinking through like some of the creative metrics. So we talked about uptime, we talked about things like that, but just, again, back to the fundamentals, right? How do I do vuln management constructively, creatively? So like, in an operational environment or in a lab environment, right? How many, you probably, especially if you're running manufacturing operations or you're running any sort of lab environments, I'm sure, but even on enterprise, right? You're probably running legacy technology somewhere, right? You're running, or you're running technologies that run workloads that are important for some part of your production process or some part of your enterprise operations, that they run some critical workload, and so you can only patch them in some weird time, right? And there's a weird process to do that. But being able to map those, capture like what systems do I know that I have in my environment, right, that are running critical workloads, but that have known vulnerabilities published against them, right? And being able to use that to score and then inform, right, your risk posture. So that should all pull through and roll up to whatever your enterprise risk program looks like. And you can score that different ways, you can weight that different ways. That's all going to depend on how important those processes are to your business operations. But I think the being able to provide that context to, because again, if you're talking to a risk officer, right, or your risk and compliance guy, he doesn't care at all about those TTPs. No. But how those TTPs, right, where you have known threat actors in our industry, right? Hey, we've seen 3 threat actors exploiting this vulnerability this month within this industry. And oh, by the way, that vulnerability runs these critical processes for the business. Now that resonates, right? So we have to do this. And that's where you can go back to an operational leader and say, hey, I know this is critical, but we might have to accept some risk of downtime, or we may have to accept some risk of impact here because there's a larger risk that obviously you get hit by ransomware or something like that, that's going to crush your operations, right? So I think just thinking through how we pull that data out and then contextualize it in a meaningful way. And I'd even go back to, for some, again, the fundamentals, right? Some of this is just how do I build a security culture within the business? That's right. And stories go a long way to making that resonate, right? And to getting capturing user attention and driving changes in user behavior. And I think so Intel can even play a key role there, where one, you can give them examples and you can talk to them about it, but then you can emulate what you're seeing in those AI-driven attacks and things like that, because they are really, really impressive. There's some cool ones that I could talk about that we've seen, but like some of the syntax and everything they're pulling in now with Gen AI is incredible.
I think the other important thing when we talk about like how machine learning is going to improve security posture is dynamic policy assignment based upon vulnerability assessment and known threat.
That's right.
Right? So you may allow people to use thumb drives when their machine is perfectly safe, but if you identify that it's vulnerable to certain techniques or malicious activity, you might say that dynamically change the policy of that endpoint. We're always looking for kind of this nirvana of highest detection efficacy, lowest false positive rate, and least impact to the system and the user in front of that system, right? And that's a really hard equation to match, but AI can actually help us now kind of query that machine, understand the user behavior, understand the risk profile of the asset and the user sitting in front of it, and then dynamically assign a policy that says, until that vulnerability is patched, I'm going to change your device control policy that says you can no longer use thumb drives until that machine has been patched. Right? But that shouldn't be a manual process, right? This has to be an automated process through AI.
And there are examples where we've seen attacks where had something like that been implemented, it would have made a big difference.
Absolutely.
Right. So, and that technology exists. I think this is sort of playing at my heartstrings from the standpoint of what Google Cloud's approach was. They said, okay, we run one of the largest, if not the largest, infrastructure in the world, and we have over 10 companies that we each have over 1 billion users that we need to keep safe every single solitary day. And because we own data centers, fiber, cable, I think roughly a third of the world's internet traffic goes on runs on our fiber. So it's these are the things that we did at scale just to operate our own services for the public, and we started to realize, wow, this puts us in a really interesting position to begin to apply this in other ways, this intelligence capability. So not only are we applying it to our own customers, so for example, you mentioned, applying what we're seeing across the board, not just in one area, but in all the areas that we're operating to our Gmail users, right? To be able to more accurately keep spam filters working so that you don't even have to think about that. Right? That's AI capabilities on the background working for your advantage. But then with the Mandiant acquisition and VirusTotal and all of those capabilities, seeing the newest and most novel threats that are happening as they are unfolding, we have examples where we were able to operationalize that intelligence, seeing it first time, and then applying it for our customers in near real time, because we have the scope and scale of AI to be able to do that and implement it and then taking the corpus that we had from a unique position and being able to train large language models in security very specifically, and then now offer that to the public and say, now you could put these capabilities into your SOC, and you have the ability to apply threat intelligence in near real time, infused with the AI capabilities that we've been using for a very long time. These are huge changes in the industry, right? We looked at it and said, okay, intelligence plus expertise plus technology will give you the defender's advantage and the competitive advantage that you need in your organization. And I think these are the kinds of reactions that have come from our experience of seeing from an investigative standpoint, right? Mandiant going into breaches, into incidents, and discovering that about 40% of the time, there was malware in place for backdoor capabilities. That's a huge number, right?
Yep.
We have got to do something to better detect that faster, because some of those had signatures that we could have picked up on, or behaviors that would have alerted us. And so we need to get that intelligence where it needs to go. And we need to provide the technology that goes with it, coupled with the expertise, so you can reduce the noise, right, and get to signal much, much faster. But I'm sharing this because this was a really important approach that we brought to the table, because we were, like some others, fairly uniquely positioned to be able to do something, and we want to make sure that we're bringing those learnings as well as capabilities into the hands of the public for their own use. So I know we touched on this, but I want to make sure that from a competitive advantage perspective, we're really hitting on that, because we've talked a little bit about what more we can do with intelligence and what more decision makers can do with intelligence. Ryan, I know this is something that you and I have talked about for years, something we're both very passionate about. So I want to give you the floor for a moment and really dig into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about competitive advantage, so there's this area that I think is relatively underserved by Intel providers in general, which is how do we do product security better, right? Even to a degree, how do we do application security better? We're getting better on application security, but I think product sec is a lot of times overlooked. And look, part of this is just by virtue of the way companies organize themselves, right? Usually you'll have an enterprise IT team that'll have, you'll have an enterprise security team, and product will be on its own. They're kind of on their own program, right? They've got their own development cycles. They might have their own data protection processes, right? You're already kind of federated, and it creates these silos, but those silos create seams of opportunity for threat actors, right? And so I think what we need, and what we're trying to work on the Accenture front, is how do we extend, right, the value that we get from how threat actors are coming after, doing batteries, right? We were selling to a lot of automotive OEMs, right? There's like 3 versions of software that you can use in a battery system that's going to go into an OEM. 3, and they've been around forever. We're just building on top of them. And you have to have a highly specialized, right, automotive like security expert to just dig into and actually product test any software that you're building out. So batteries, right, you use a battery management system. So there's some software components there. And those software components have the ability to touch everything else on a connected vehicle, because we're just driving around computers these days. So but for us, it became, I started pushing hard on how, what were our processes for, right, pen testing all of our systems before they went out. And look, partners help in this because your contract, your third party consumers can help in this too, because like OEMs have, massive lists of requirements that you've got to be responsible for. But I think making sure that you've got policy that touches on not just what are we doing for the enterprise, but how are we extending what we're doing to the enterprise? Like if we're doing regular attack surface management, how are we thinking about that in the product realm, right? If we're doing vuln management, how are we thinking about that in the product realm? If we're doing regular pen testing, if we're doing any sort of response and recovery drills and things like that, how are we doing the same thing in product? Both because it'll make us a better team. We'll be more resilient over time, right? We'll get better at detection and response. We'll have a better understanding of where visibility lies. And look, some of that's just like, hey, we're we're using, whatever, we're spinning up a new Amazon cluster over here for something. It's just new infrastructure. And you guys know how hard it is to keep tabs on all your infrastructure. Yeah. Some of our endpoint providers are helping a lot, though, with that now. So I think just really figuring out, and it depends on the industry you're in, it depends on what you produce, but figuring out how you at least create a visibility layer across that. And so they should be, right, what helps those teams, right? Let's get them the context that they need. That might, and what's the form factor that needs to come in, right? Is it just a feed? Is it just certain types of indicators? Is it certain material they can go hunt on?
Right.
Or is it something more advanced than that you develop uniquely?
We also, we have these two different models we think about, like the pyramid of pain is one where, at the very top, it's just the random TTP stuff, or TTPs that are at the very bottom of the information. The other model I look at is the one that says data is big, information gets smaller, knowledge gets even smaller than that, and insight is what we're looking for, because insight is actionable.
Yep.
Right.
And I think from an advantage perspective, we need to drive as much product innovation that leverages the lower two levels. You may never get to actual TTP level, that's kind of hard. But the behavioral side, I would argue, is even harder, because it's more than just an atomic, it's a series of events. It's semantic understanding of what's actually happening. But the way we've leveraged it is, and by tying it to our AI as well, our interactive kind of response generative AI, the RAG model that we have, allows you to ask simple questions in natural language that then pulls from a knowledge base of information to know how to get the context required to ask that question in the most effective and efficient query. So if you ask the question, how many of my machines in my Denver office are vulnerable to this CVE, have exhibited behaviors associated with Wizard Spider, sourced from a country in an ITAR or OFAC nation, and that Mandiant says is a 7 or above on a threat scope. Like, that's a very complex query to have to build. The context it's gathering is from private sources, right? Who are my machines in Denver? Private sources, which machines are vulnerable? So I need that context to come in as well. OFAC and ITAR, external source, pull that in. Vulnerable to this CVE and known by, or Wizard Spider TTPs. Again, public curated response. But it's and Mandiant ranks it a certain amount. Like, that's where we feed that information in so that the analyst or the practitioner doesn't have to know what the information means, what it is. All he has to know is that I have a risk threshold, a risk appetite of 7. Let's just say it's 7, right? And if I ask the right question and it then queries that information, I get a summarized list. I also do a talk on leveraging AI without displacing the human intellectual capital. And I like to say there's two things. Never expect a human to be really good at large analytic processing, hypothesis testing, summarization of large-scale data, but never expect an analytic model to be strategic, innovative, or ethical, right? And so by bringing AI in, you can take this third-party consumption and ingestion of telemetry, take the information from a reputable source of threat intel, merge those together, but the interface to the user has to be one that he's comfortable with. And a SOC analyst today did not learn how to threat hunt. Well, first of all, they didn't learn how to write their thesis by going to the public library and pulling down a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas, right? They learned by going to a Google prompt, asking a question, saying, that's close, I'm gonna refine my question a little bit, narrow it down, then they copy and paste into their thesis, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we need to meet the users where they are, and that is interactive natural language queries wherever possible. But simplifying the telemetry and the data that these systems provide and making it unique and actionable to that persona. Because again, multiple stakeholders need it for different things. To this point, you don't need more than just a simple dashboard at the CISO level or C-suite and up, but the practitioner definitely needs more context.
There's 2 questions I want to make sure we get to. The next one is, 2 years from now, what do you hope the audience will have done differently, or what do you hope the industry would have done differently, or what do you think would be really important to have change?
I'd love to see, because I think we're building this right now at Accenture, right? It, like, for us, for our internal use, right?
Yep.
We're building kind of exactly what you just described.
Yep.
I'd love, and I think we're moving in that direction from an industry perspective. Organizations will need help putting that together. But it's so critical to make accessible the Intel data that we have, but within the context of my individual use case, being able to build these smart queries. Look, with you know, pick your AI assistant, right? With Gemini out there, you know, we're going to know how to write those queries. We're getting better at that already because we use those for, you know, and the workforce, right? Your workforce is already mobilizing that technology to their advantage, right? Whether that's to help write summaries, meeting summaries, stuff like that. We're already learning how to use that as part of our workflows. Just taking that and applying it, you know, as part of a business workflow. And I hope that it's advanced a little bit more to start making creative suggestions, which actually Google Threat Intel has put this into Mandiant Advantage. But to start then doing suggestive, like, you know, hey, what about this query, or what about these things that matter, just where you can start to help the practitioners.
Yep.
To help the practitioners think about that. I think you mentioned, you hit on a really important point though, which is, you know, I do think we also need to not get lazy, right? You know, good security operations isn't teaching a level 1 SOC analyst to wait for a button to go, you know, a light bulb to go from green to red and then to escalate an incident, right? It's really to figure out how to think creatively. And we do need to collapse that cycle, right? Because it's cost savings at the end of the day. It's talent, like we have a talent shortage, right? It helps us with the talent shortage. And it ultimately will be more effective.
I also think that, and this might be a panacea that we may never get back to. I started my career at a small company in Rochester, New Hampshire called Cabletron Systems. For those of you that have been around long enough, you might remember Cabletron. And I was stationed at Bell South in Atlanta. And if something happened in a central office and every vendor would show up, you'd leave your vendor hat at the door, you'd all sit in a room and try to solve the problem for the customer. Didn't matter whose problem it was everyone's problem to solve. I really hope we get to a more collaborative environment where we can crowdsource so that I don't have to wait, I don't have to be the first customer to experience something that other customers are also experiencing for the first time, right? There needs to be, with the right level of anonymization, the ability to say, I'm seeing this. I'm going to publish that via a vendor community, via a threat intel provider, to say, here's what I've seen, here's how I saw it, and here's how I responded to it, either successfully or unsuccessfully. And that should inform the decisions of others so that we don't all have to be patient zero.
Yeah.
Right?
So given our time, I'm just going to wrap up the discussion by just offering the last point. And that is the Better Together story that we are here for. And what that looks like is, as Ryan alluded to, is we are already working together, right? The companies here and many, many, many others. And I would say the thing I want to see is that I want you, the audience, to partner with partners who are taking you into the future. Because what we know from the threats that you've heard about all day today and all day tomorrow, doing the same things the same way that we've always done them won't work. You're not protected that way. But instead, really seeking out, especially while you're here at a tech conference, go to the expo floor, learn what is happening, see what we've been talking about exists today. It exists today, the ability to bring many forms of intelligence in, applying AI, quickly identifying what is a priority, what is not a priority, offering solutions, doing some of that SOC 1 analyst thinking for you, doing some of the coding for you so that you can get to a resolution and security much faster. We have examples right now already today where we've been able to see something happening in one area, new and novel, apply the mitigations that we've created in almost near real time, create that safe environment, notify the customer that they're secure before the customer ever even knew that the original software or the original product had been compromised, or before they were even able to identify it in their environment. That's the power of applying AI. That's the power of getting to real intelligence and creating a competitive advantage with that. So that with that, we're out of time, but I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank you, our audience today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.